Glenn, we've got some breaking news out of court today that might signal some actual legal exposure for Donald Trump personally. Can you explain what just happened?
Yeah, a federal court judge in Pennsylvania just ruled that a civil suit that was brought against Donald Trump for defamation, for lies, what sure looked like lies he told about a group of young men often referred to as the Central Park Five. They now refer to themselves, and others rightly refer to them as the exonerated five, because they were accused of committing a rape in Central Park in New York that they did not commit. They've been fully exonerated. But that never stopped Donald Trump from continuing to tell his lies about how they were guilty. He went so far as to say they pleaded guilty. No, they didn't. So that's not really a matter of opinion. It's a matter of fact, which, Brian, is one of the things that prompted the judge to say, I am not dismissing this suit against Donald Trump. It will continue forward. It will head in the direction of trial. And I think one of the reasons that Donald Trump is so desperate to try to get this case dismissed, which it doesn't look like now he will succeed in doing, is because the Supreme Court long ago said, you may not be able to prosecute criminally a sitting president, but you know what you can do? You can force him to go to trial in a civil case even while he is sitting as president of the United States. So it looks like at least this trial will be moving forward against Donald Trump.
Glenn, I know that in a civil trial, you don't have to actually be there, but it is possible then for a trial to proceed against him while he's in office for defamation?
Yes, in the Paula Jones versus Bill Clinton case, the Supreme Court said definitively that a president can defend himself in the context of a civil lawsuit that's brought against him even while he is president of the United States, because they said, it really doesn't present the kind of interference with the duties of a president that, for example, a criminal case would present, where a president would have to be sitting in court all day, right, every day, because you must be present at your own criminal trial if you're a defendant, but you don't have to attend your own civil trial. Indeed, you can just pay your lawyers, send them in to defend the case, and you don't even have to make an appearance, which I think is in part what caused the Supreme Court to rule that no, a civil suit against a sitting president can proceed even while he's in the Oval Office.
Well, to that point, Glenn, given the landscape that we're living in right now, is it possible that Trump could actually challenge the ability of a plaintiff to try him civilly and get that question relitigated by the Supreme Court? A Supreme Court, by the way, that may be perfectly willing to say, we were content to allow it when Bill Clinton was in office, but suddenly we don't think that it's a viable option anymore now that Trump is in office.
Brian, that's the perfect question, because no matter how good the news is coming out of trial courts, as is today's news, coming out of federal circuit courts of appeal, as you and I always sort of end up discussing, is what happens in the Supreme Court.
Right.
And I absolutely believe that you're right. I would make the same prediction. Donald Trump will probably try to get the Supreme Court to revisit its ruling in Jones v. Clinton and ask them to overturn it and say, you know what? A sitting president shouldn't even have to be made to defend against a civil lawsuit while he's in office. And it is anybody's guess as to what this Supreme Court would do. It sure seems like there are 4 or 5 justices who have an insatiable appetite to help Donald Trump. So it may very well be that they will throw up that shield for him as well. Only time will tell.
How does the Supreme Court's presidential immunity ruling factor in here? Because I believe that ruling was regarding criminal activity, and obviously this is a civil matter, but is there any way that it could extend to civil matters as well?
Yeah, so to answer the first part of the question, the presidential immunity case and the Supreme Court ruling has absolutely no bearing on civil lawsuits. It exclusively deals with a president's liability in the context of a criminal prosecution. However, courts all the time extend doctrines. They will decide a case based on a certain set of facts, but then a new case will come along that would require an extension of the previously announced doctrine. So it could very well be that the Supreme Court said, listen, this court has only had occasion to pass on the question of whether a president should be subject to criminal prosecution while he's in court. But now that we have a vehicle, a case before us, if this case makes it up to the Supreme Court, that would require us to extend that protection to a president in the context of a civil lawsuit, we are willing to take up that question. And again, it only takes a 5-justice majority to say we're going to extend it. We're also going to make all civil lawsuits, be put on hold, be stayed, be paused while the president is in office. And then, they can proceed or pick up where they left off once Donald Trump leaves office, if Donald Trump ever leaves office.
Well, Glenn, we're talking about this presidential immunity concept as if it's real. I mean, they just made it up out of whole cloth, and so of course they could extend it to civil matters, because even the doctrine in and of itself, at the heart of this matter, is made up. And we're in a different world here, where they have just concocted out of whole cloth this brand new concept of presidential immunity for criminal matters. And so we're like, oh, well, we're not sure if it would extend to civil matters. It's not real. They've just made it up in deference to Trump, and so of course there's really nothing stopping them from extending this thing that was already made up in the first place to also include something that would also be made up.
Yeah, and Brian, let's not forget that the presidential immunity ruling, yes, it was made up out of whole cloth, but I think even more disturbingly, it contradicts the very language of the Constitution, right, which says a president shall take care to faithfully execute the laws of our nation, which is kind of the polar opposite, as the president gets to violate all laws of our nation with impunity and immunity. And it also is contradicted in the impeachment judgment clause, which says that a president can be impeached by the House, tried on that article of impeachment by the Senate, and convicted on that article of impeachment, and he can still be prosecuted. Again, kind of feels like the polar opposite of he can't be prosecuted. So I will always emphasize what one of our preeminent constitutional scholars, Yale professor Akil Reed Amar, said. He said, in a very real sense, in the presidential immunity case, the Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution is unconstitutional. And Brian, where do we go when the Supreme Court abuses its judicial discretion?
So we've spoken about the Supreme Court here, but Trump doesn't necessarily need to go all the way up to the Supreme Court to find some, nebulous statute from 1812 that might back him up in his quest to not face any accountability. So is there the possibility that he could do exactly that he can go out into the history books and find some arbitrary act from like the 19th century that he can then say, oh, well, based on my perverted interpretation of this act, I hereby declare that I cannot be subject to any civil exposure in court?
Yeah, he can try. I think he'll be hard-pressed to find any support, no matter how far back he goes in our nation's history. You're kind of alluding to another act from the 1798, the Alien Enemies Act, that he invoked recently improperly and unconstitutionally, as it turns out. But, that has to do at its core with national security, the Alien Enemies Act. He's misusing it, but setting that aside, I don't know that he will find any historical support, no matter how far back he goes, for, a civil lawsuit against the president, not being permitted to proceed. Now, he can try, but as of right now, we've got a solid trial court opinion. I assume Donald Trump will appeal it up to the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals, and then he'll try to bubble it up to the Supreme Court. But importantly, this new decision that the defamation case can proceed did not litigate the issue of whether a president should be immune from civil lawsuits. That's well-settled law by the Supreme Court. So this was really about whether the defamation claim brought by the exonerated 5 can proceed, whether it was appropriately pled. And the trial court judge said, yes, it can proceed. He did dismiss one of the charges, intentional infliction of emotional distress, but he dismissed it with leave for the plaintiffs to refile it and clean up a minor deficiency. But right now, this case is on track and it's headed toward a trial.
Well, we know full well that Donald Trump will not be in that courtroom. And so does it make it any more likely that the exonerated five will be successful in this defamation case, knowing full well that the defendant didn't even bother showing up to defend himself?
Yeah, so when a defendant opts, or a respondent in a civil suit, we use both words, opts not to appear, a judge will instruct the jury that they shouldn't hold that against the defendant because the defendant is not required by law to appear. I have a feeling there's some atmospheric damage that is done in the minds of the jurors, notwithstanding the judge's instruction, that if this guy couldn't even bother to show up to his own trial in which he is accused of defaming five men who were not only exonerated, but whom Donald Trump lied about, inarguably. He said, for example, they all pleaded guilty. No, they didn't. They pleaded not guilty. Now, admittedly, they had some confessions coerced out of them early on in the investigation. They retracted those confessions. The exonerated five actually settled with the city of New York for wrongful convictions. Donald Trump has been lying about these men for a very long time. So on the merits, this case is strong. And frankly, whether Donald Trump attends or not, if this case gets to trial, I have a feeling you're going to see a libel verdict for defamation with perhaps a big money judgment award.
Glenn, how has Donald Trump fared in the efforts to undo the judgments that have already been levied against him at the hands of E. Jean Carroll, for example?
Not well. None of the judgments against him, the civil judgments, as best I recall, have been vacated, right? You have two E. Jean Carroll verdicts against him, two
one
juries.
for $5 million, the other for $83.3 million, if I'm not mistaken.
Exactly. And then you have a third civil case that was brought against him by the New York Attorney General, Letitia James, and he was ordered to pay, I think, upwards of $500 million. That is now in the appeals court. But as of right now, there have been no civil judgments that have been entirely overturned. So his track record is not terribly good.
And so if he goes to trial, it is not likely that, at least based on the precedent that we have thus far for E. Jean Carroll and also Tish James, that this is the kind of thing that could be as easily overturned, or that higher courts would have an appetite to overturn as criminal matters, for example, where we've seen that the Supreme Court has been pretty willing to intervene.
Yeah, it's hard. You know, every case sort of stands on its own facts and its own jury verdict. But, you know, Donald Trump has not had a lot of luck in the context of civil suits. Of course, he's had almost nothing but luck in the context of criminal prosecutions. Think about it. The only criminal case against him that managed to get to trial among the, I think, 4 total criminal cases that were pending against him before he got elected was the New York case. And Brian, I said for a very long time, as soon as any of these criminal cases make their way into a courtroom proper and the evidence is presented to those 12 people, you know, in a wooden box sitting as the conscience of the community, Donald Trump is going to be convicted in a New York minute. And in fact, that's exactly what happened in the prosecution in New York. 34 felony convictions, and the jury barely had time for a lunch break before they handed down those 34 guilty verdicts. But Donald Trump, you know, had a whole lot of luck at his back because all of the other criminal cases against him went away when he was elected.
Well, we will, of course, stay on top of this issue, and hopefully we see some justice here for these folks who are, you know, on the constant receiving end of Donald Trump's defamatory comments, his libelous comments. So for those who are watching right now, if you want to follow along, please make sure to subscribe. That's the best way to support our work and to support independent media more broadly. I'll put the links to both of our channels right here on this screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.